Welcome everyone to this Ethics in AI Colloquium on the topic of the false choice between digital regulation and innovation. And we are extremely fortunate to have a bona fide academic superstar as our main speaker today, as shown by the presence of her fan base here as well. Anu Bradford, who is the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia Law School. Among other positions, she's the author of The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, published by OUP in 2020, which has been described as one of the most important books about Europe published in recent decades. And more recently, she's widened her scope to global domination, this book called Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology. So we're delighted that despite the efforts of Eurostar to inhibit her coming here, Anu is here and ready to talk to us about some of the innovative research that she's doing. I'm also delighted to welcome our three excellent commentators. First is Caroline Green, colleague at the Institute for Ethics in AI. Caroline is our new Director of Research, and she's heading up the not yet announced Accelerator program, which is very exciting. And I may have just announced it now, but without any full information. And that's right. She's written extensively about the rights of older people. She's currently working on generative AI in care homes, and also with me on a project about rebooting the Ruggie principles. Our second commentator is Professor Ignacio Cofone. He's the newly appointed Professor of Law and Regulation of AI at the Institute, and he's also a fellow of this splendid college. He has wide-ranging interests in the regulation of technology, especially around AI-driven social and economic changes and how the law should respond to them. And he's the author of The Privacy Fallacy, Harm and Power in the Information Economy. And last but not least, Professor Carl-Benedikt Frey, who is the Dieter Schwartz Associate Professor of AI and Work at the Oxford Internet Institute and a Fellow of Mansfield College. And he is the author of an important book called The Technology Trap, Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation. So thanks to all of you. I think without further ado, turn it over to you, Anu.
So John, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation. And I really have a terrific panel here today, so I don't want to go too long in my initial remarks. Also really looking forward to your question conversation with you. So let me start with the premise of this paper, which builds on the work that I have done, often seen as a championing the Europe's regulatory agenda. And in many ways, that regulatory agenda is now coming into a closer scrutiny as the Europeans are facing this urgent need to address the kind of innovation deficit, the technological gap between the United States and the EU, and also China and the European Union. And there is this sense that the Europeans have really excelled as a regulator, take even some pride in that Brussels effect is shaping the global regulatory environment. But there is this concern that, look, is that regulation actually holding us back as innovators? So if I ask a room full of people to name a European tech company, it sometimes takes them a while, but they're very quick to name the GDPR. So there is this notion that how does the Europeans become not just a referee, but also a player in this game and learn to play offense and defense and play it well. So my main claim is that we should not be portraying this as a choice that we are making, that either we can regulate, we can commit to digital rights and their protection, or we choose the path for innovation, because it is ultimately possible to have both. But let me just set the stage. I think it's intuitively clear for all of you that the Europeans are having a problem with innovation, or at least commercializing the innovation. There is a deep, deep gap between the tech success of the US and the Europeans. So if you think about just all these biggest tech companies, the Googles and the Amazons and so forth, they're all American. There are no similar platforms coming from Europe. And if you think about the market cap of, for instance, the 5 largest companies, you take Amazon and Alphabet and Meta and Microsoft and Nvidia, we talk about over 10 trillion in market cap. Just Apple and Meta combined have a market cap that is larger, and take this, the 100 largest market cap companies listed in London Stock Exchange. I mean, that is bad. That really does not look good. And if you look at AI, the American companies are investing in AI about 6 times more than European companies. The 10 largest investors in quantum computing come from the United States and China, and not from Europe. So we really need to look at what is explaining that the Europeans are lagging so much behind. So somehow, I don't know if our goal is to create a European Google. Maybe if we don't like the business model of European Google, that should not be the goal. But we would still like to be featuring some European tech companies that are really sort of remaking our societies and our economies and generating the kind of wealth that the Europeans desperately need. So there is this notion that Europeans are not able to generate innovations because they are so preoccupied with regulation, and that is reinforced because Americans are famous for not regulating. Americans are associated with this idea of very hands-off approach to technology regulation. So I've written about this in sort of describing the American regulatory model in the digital space as a market-driven regulatory model. So Americans are obsessed with prioritizing free market, free speech, and free internet and incentives to innovate. So the idea there is that the government needs to retreat and assume a very trivial role, and the Americans are basically handing over the governance of technology to the tech companies themselves. So it's a techno-libertarian, techno-optimist view of the world. So I contrast that with the European priors, and the Europeans subscribe to what I have described a rights-driven regulatory model that is really seeking to foster a human-centric digital development where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals, the preservation of democratic structures of the society, and the pursuit of a more fair digital transformation takes center stage. So the Europeans want to redistribute power away from the largest platforms to smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. But then now the question I want us to focus on, does this come at the cost? And I argue no. And so let me just give you a few initial thoughts of why we should be decoupling this idea that there is a cost to having this strong commitment to digital rights. One thing, that there was very little digital regulation in Europe before 2010. That's when the big antitrust cases, competition law cases against the tech giants began. There was the Data Privacy Directive from 1995, which was much weaker still in its protection of digital rights than the GDPR of 2016. But there was very little in terms of digital regulation in place in Europe at the time when companies like Google and Facebook were founded in 1998 and 2004. Yet those companies were founded in the US and not in Europe, even though there was very little regulation in the digital space in both places. So that's just one example. But then when the Europeans have started to regulate, they've also very heavily regulated American tech companies with their digital regulations. So all these regulations around privacy and antitrust and content moderation, they are targeting American tech companies, and we are not really worried that these companies are not innovating enough. We're more worried about the European regulation not actually effectively holding these companies to an account. So then, if my initial prior is that there may then be something else going on, if it's not the digital regulation that is explaining the European laggard status as an innovator, what would be those alternative reasons? But before I go there, let me just give you a couple of examples how I don't want to make the claim that all digital regulation is beneficial. I rather want to make the claim that even if all digital regulation is not beneficial, we need to think that neither is all kind of innovation beneficial. So rather the question is, what kind of innovation do we want to foster with our digital regulation? So if we take a look at rules like the GDPR, yes, I think it has had some negative effects on innovation, especially on smaller and medium-sized companies. I'm not worried about the Googles of the world having the resources to comply with the GDPR. It is disproportionately more burdensome on small and medium-sized companies. I think that is undisputed. And there are also some adverse effects on innovation because it does take resources to comply. It does make it harder for you to harness the kind of data you can use, for instance, to train your AI models. But then there are also positive sides to the regulation, where the regulations like the GDPR have actually fostered innovation, where you think about privacy being a quality element of the product that gives consumers greater trust and creates then also greater market uptake for those products because the consumers know that their privacy is protected. Ask a company like Apple, privacy is a core brand of the company, and they have been able to monetize that really well. So in addition to pursuing the kind of social innovation through better privacy practices, the companies can reap the benefits of market innovation and create a monetization of privacy. So my argument is rather that these digital regulations can cut both ways. They can at times hinder innovation, but they can also benefit and create more innovation. And since many of here really, and in this colloquium, focus on AI, one of the biggest arguments of the Commission with the AI Act was that it will create greater consumer trust. There is a lot of unease around the world on the risk associated with AI. And when consumers and companies know that AI is regulated in a way that it is safer, it is also going to open market opportunities. So let me now move to the main argument of the paper, which is I'm trying to offer an alternative explanation then to this technology gap, if it is not mainly digital regulation. So in the paper, I argue that there are 4 primary reasons that are much more important in explaining why the Europeans are behind the Americans in tech innovation. One is the absence of a digital single market in Europe. Second is the absence of deep, robust capital markets in Europe. Third is the legal frameworks and cultural attitudes around risk-taking. So I'm going to talk about bankruptcy laws. And the fourth is Europe's inability to match the Americans in attracting the global talent. So let me now walk you through those 4 issues that to me are particularly important. So first is this idea that there is no digital single market in Europe. It is very hard for tech companies in Europe to scale across 27 different EU member states. There are different languages. So it was much easier for Amazon to start as a bookseller in the United States, where there was this demand for English-speaking books. Whereas in Europe, you have different linguistic needs, and the market demand then changes. The same thing with the cultural expectations. You have videos on demand, the Netflixes of the world. The American in Michigan is more likely to watch similar movies to that American in Virginia or New York when you compare to the demand for movies in Latvia and Portugal. So there are also differences in the cultural demand, but also legal obstacles that could be removed, where there are still differences in regulatory frameworks across the 27 member states that make it then harder for any company to scale in the EU when they need to make modifications to their products and services. The second, super important, is capital. The presence of that capital, the accessibility of that capital in the US, and the lack of similar access in the European Union. There is no a deep integrated capital markets union in the EU. And the availability of the venture capital is far less than in the US. So the European tech companies do pretty well in getting seed funding in the European Union. But as soon as they move to the subsequent larger funding rounds, they need to turn to US venture capital, or they are acquired by the US tech giants. They cannot fund themselves in Europe. There are also issues like how we would unleash the capital that could be invested in Europe. We have a lot of institutional investors, including pension funds, that just are restricted in their ability to invest in venture capital. Just this morning I was reading our breakfast Financial Times, and one of the columnists was citing this figure that 0.01% of European pension fund capital is invested in venture capital. I mean, that's where the capital would be, but we are not investing it in this space. So again, not the story that the GDPR is holding the European tech companies back, it's that they cannot be funded the same way in Europe. Well, you could say that the capital is mobile. It doesn't need to be that the Europeans fund European tech companies. Why doesn't Silicon Valley fund European tech companies? And they do to some extent. So some storied venture capital firms like Sequoia established itself in London really as a sign that there are opportunities in Europe. But there's still this tendency that when you make really risky bets, you want to know the players. They are part of that. If you're part of that Silicon Valley ecosystem where you want to be actively managing the companies, you know how to, if they need a new CTO, well, you went to Stanford with that person, so you're going to bring them in. They were in this other venture that you funded, and you're going to find how the talent and money meet one another. And it's much harder to make those bets to a company in Lisbon or Helsinki or where have you, where you don't know the players and you won't be watching daily what the company is doing. So capital is not perfectly mobile when it comes to the riskiest of investments. Okay, so the lack of the digital single market, the lack of a unified capital markets union. Third, the legal frameworks and cultural attitudes towards risk-taking. So trying to do really hard things is very risky. And pursuing really disruptive innovations in technologies like AI, you need to make big bets. And you are not going to make those bets if you feel like your failure is going to be fatal, that you're not given a second chance if you go bankrupt. Well, under the European bankruptcy laws, you are often done. You try hard and you fail and you will not raise money again. Whereas in the US, it's not the case. It's built into the venture capital market model. They know you do hard things and you often fail. So you fail and you go and raise more money in the US, they give you more money because it seems like you're working on big things. And it's a very different thing. In Europe, there's also a lot of cultural stigma around failure. It's embarrassing. And in the US, it's just not the same. It's going to fail fast, fail often, and move on and go for the next big thing. And I think that also would need to change in Europe. So if you look at, for instance, the OECD is listing the sort of stringency of bankruptcy laws. The most stringent bankruptcy laws are in Sweden, Portugal, Czech Republic, and many other European countries. The most lenient, most generous bankruptcy laws are in the United States, Canada, in Turkey, in some other places. So this is, again, something concrete that we could do. Fourth, and this to me is extremely, extremely important. Americans have been very successful in tapping into the global talent that come to the US and benefit the American innovations. So if you look at, for instance, over $1 billion startups in the US, over 50% of those have an immigrant founder. And if we focus for a moment on the household names, the biggest tech companies that we all think about and their founders, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, South African. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, Brazilian. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Russian. This is a huge part of American success. And there are many other elements in why these talented entrepreneurs do want to come to the US and not Europe. And one is the universities. We are now in one of the greatest European universities. But Europe is not full of universities that are major gateways for global talent. If you look at some rankings of like top 50 universities in the world, half of those are in the United States. And they're very important gateways for immigrants. So over 50% of the PhD students in STEM fields in the US are given to foreign nationals. Over 70% of those foreign nationals who do their PhDs in these fields in the US stay in the US and benefit the American labor market. So there are the factors, including the important gateways, the universities, that really then encourage the entrepreneurs to come to the US. Also, because the universities are very, very attached to the startup ecosystems. They then found a way to start their business. They can start innovating in the universities. American universities take a much smaller cut than European universities if you invent something and you have a patent at the time when you are at the university. So again, your pathway to entrepreneurship through universities is much stronger. So to me, those are some of the main issues. We can add something, including more flexible labor markets, but they are just some that I want to highlight here to try to make the case that if the Europeans want to close that technology gap, they should not be thinking about if they need to, for instance, scrap the AI Act so that we can have AI companies. I can promise you, even if we decided to now put that whole AI Act on hold, which I think would be a terrible idea, it's not that somehow 5 years from now, all those AI companies would emanate from Europe. No, the only thing that worries me with this regulatory agenda is if that saps all the energy and all the political salience, and the Europeans fail at the same time to build those other pillars of the tech ecosystem that are absolutely crucial for the tech companies to grow and thrive in Europe. So that's now kind of my message to the Europeans. If you have read the Draghi report, it's 400 pages, but there's a lot of good, not that uplifting, but really sort of urgent messaging there. And maybe there's something, if you think about the political moment right now, I want to end that I'm a huge believer in Europe. I think I made my whole career as being a champion of the European Union. But in many ways, the biggest supporters of Europe need to be its most honest critics. And this is something that I think the Europeans cannot afford to wait and sort of just expect that somehow they can continue making marginal adjustment and somehow be okay. Because the geopolitics around us are not generous to us. So if you think about the US presidential elections, it does heighten the idea that Americans cannot be trusted to be our partners and to work with us. They will be pursuing the American first ideology. The Europeans are facing geopolitically and economically the kind of era where the Europeans are increasingly alone and they need to think about their technological sovereignty, their strategic autonomy. The needs for funding in Europe are really paramount. So if you think about we're rebuilding our armies, we need to most likely rebuild the Ukrainian army if the Americans are pulling their support. Or we certainly need to fund the rebuilding of Ukraine. We need to somehow pay for green transformation, for digital transformation. We need to somehow fund the big demographic challenges and protect our welfare states going forward. The money needs to come from somewhere. And it's not going to come through state subsidies alone. And it really is, if you look at what Draghi even mentions as what mainly explains why the American productivity growth has been so much greater than European, is that we missed the internet revolution. So we cannot afford to miss the AI revolution. So to have that technological development and innovation is the foundation for European growth. And that is a precondition for all those issues that we care about, including our prosperity and including peace and our general well-being as societies. So let me maybe end it there. And I really look forward to the comments and questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You guys are happy to keep seated, yeah? Okay. Thank you so much, Anu. That was great. And I'm now going to turn it over to Caroline, who will begin with the first set of comments.
Yeah, can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. So thank you so much for this really inspiring contribution. There's a lot of energy and I think positivity in it. So a little disclaimer also, I did some introspection when I was preparing for this talk, and I think I'm a big believer and supporter of Europe and in your nuanced approach to regulation as well. So it seems to me that when it comes to technology and AI specifically, there are some myths or really widely held public narratives and views. Digital regulation conflicting with innovation being one of them. Another example, perhaps also the urgent existential threats posed by AI. Indeed, only yesterday I was at a care tech conference and I heard some people behind me saying, oh, we don't need any regulation because our innovation is just going to stifle. And then the other one said, well, it doesn't really matter. We're going to be wiped out by the robots quite soon anyway. So dispelling these myths, or rather picking them up and bringing some nuance to them, as you have just done, is extremely important. And I really hope that this message will reach many people beyond academia and beyond this room. So firstly, I would just like to pick up on your argument that regulation can in some way support innovation, and add that it can even be necessary in some way and to some extent. Because innovation and entrepreneurship, of course, does, after all, not happen in a silo of digital regulation. There's a wider context of regulation and law in which innovation is taking place. And you mentioned the GDPR, but there's also patent law, intellectual property law, contract law, and such, which innovators need and want in order to innovate and feel safe with their innovations. Another observation I want to make directly relates to the purpose of innovation as something that strengthens our economies, brings prosperity. But I especially want to highlight that point you also made, that the potential of tech innovation to really benefit people, to solve some of these really pressing problems in so many sectors, such as healthcare, education. And one of the fundamental roles here of regulation that you have mentioned is to reduce the risks of harms to people, to their rights, their well-being. However, I feel that it is not and should not be the role of the state by itself, or states, through regulation to ensure that innovation is beneficial, at least not harmful. Rather, I'm proposing here more multi-stakeholder responsibility for innovation that reaches beyond state-produced regulation. And this multi-stakeholder responsibility encompasses private corporations. And I'm not taking this out of thin air. Private corporations, under the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, have a moral responsibility to respect human rights. And this responsibility exists notwithstanding whether or not or how a state is acting on their duty to protect human rights from adverse impact through private corporations. But beyond private corporations, I would also argue that this multi-stakeholder responsibility for innovation also extends to users of technology and AI, to investors and to society more broadly. And so this may seem like a somewhat idealistic approach. However, I want to give you a little example where this is actually currently playing out. And that's the adult social care sector here in the UK, which John has mentioned my research work focuses on. So social care is under immense resource pressures. There's not enough money, there's not enough staff. And people are in the sector incredibly excited about tech and innovation. They want it, they need it, and they are innovating. And indeed, I think we all desperately need this innovation, because there are very high chances that we're all going to be drawing on care in our lives at some point or another. So whilst it is a really heavily regulated sector, there's currently no specific tech or digital regulation for care tech innovation, and such beyond the usual privacy laws and so on. So innovators are essentially free, and we're seeing that in home care services and so on, to innovate, to test, sometimes really vulnerable people, to sell their products without specific oversight from a very specific regulator. However, in the past 9 months, a multi-stakeholder movement has formed here, in which tech innovators, care providers, frontline care workers, and people using care have come together to decide what responsible AI innovation and use entails. So tech providers have developed a pledge and a system of accountability that they want to lead by. Care workers have published a statement of demands on what it is that they need to use AI and technology safely in caring. Of course, in the future, we are likely to see more state-driven regulation regarding technology and care. However, in the meantime, the sector itself is driving their own responsibility forward. And of course, now this raises a lot of questions. How much should the state be part of this? How much do we trust the tech providers and so on? But I think it is a really inspiring example of what's happening there. And now looking also towards the US elections, I think we can carefully assume that the direction of US tech regulation probably won't follow the European model. I wonder whether you would agree with that. but I would say that pushing more of the awareness that innovators are still responsible to work ethically, even without specific tech regulation, is becoming even more important. Thank you.
Thank you. Ignacio.
I had a really good time reading Professor Bradford's article for the second time yesterday to make this comment, and I kept trying to find ways to disagree with it, but I couldn't find any, which is a problem. So for context, traditionally regulation is seen as a way to, in economic terms, internalize the externalities of innovation. So protect human rights and do lots of things that we want to happen while innovation takes place. But the fantastic thing about this article is that it shows you that besides that, regulation is key for innovation itself. And the article brings examples of IP and net neutrality, and how, because of that reason, regulation is not an obstacle, but it's something that we could have to not miss the AI revolution. And I would take that one step further. The idea that the article disintegrates is that regulation impedes innovation because it does two things, which is increase costs and constrain innovative behavior. And regulation, under that definition, are the measures that target the tech sector specifically or have a substantial effect on how tech companies operate, such as data protection law. And in page 386, the article gives you lots of examples of why regulation should be defined in that way under the argument. So the way that we could take that one step further is that under that definition, we should include private law rules as a regulatory mechanism for private orderings, because private law does exactly that too. And by reframing regulation in this way, as an economic driver that has this dual role rather than just a constraint in a way that highlights not only the social benefits of regulation broadly, but also its capacity to redefine competitive landscapes, I think we better understand its role in addressing social challenges, while also rerouting, not stopping or slowing down innovation. And this happened from the very start. Some of the first critiques to the existence of privacy law before we called it data protection law came from Posner and Stigler based on something called the Coase theorem. And this is something that techno-libertarians will keep bringing up today. The Coase theorem is this idea that if transaction costs are low and property rights are stable, whatever good you have, material or non-material, will go to those who value it the most. But that is a wide set of assumptions. The Coase theorem not only assumes low transaction costs and stable property rights, it also assumes the existence of property, the existence of contracts, the existence of enforcement mechanisms for those contracts, also rationality, but we won't talk about that today. And similarly, AI innovation also requires lots of things. It requires certain types of contracting rules, certain types of property rights, torts and criminal law to prevent third parties from interfering, corporate law to shield assets, a particular type of bankruptcy law that the article brings up, antitrust regulation, and we could keep going. So there are examples of how regulation, in the narrow sense that the proponents of the argument want to purport, also create innovation rather than restricting. For example, spillover effects on adjacent sectors. For example, a new compliance market that brings out cross-cultural applications, such as analytics for regulatory reporting. And these innovation offsets are valuable, but they may or may not exceed the compliance costs of regulation. And the AI has two mechanisms that do fall under this. The AI has two mechanisms that could lead to these innovation offsets that may or may not reduce its regulatory costs. One is AI explainability tools, because firms must innovate to meet certain explainability requirements, and this could lead to advancements, for example, in interpretable machine learning. And second, bias detection and mitigation systems, because by avoiding bias and discriminatory outcomes, you foster the development of fairness-adjusted AI, for example, and other technologies that help you with bias corrections. And these are important, but these show a broader point, which is assuming that only what has negative effects on tech companies' profits counts as regulation, and everything that has positive effects on tech companies counts as law and not regulation, which is the narrative that is sometimes pushed, kind of assumes its own conclusion. And that's a problem. And you can see that because whether it's something called regulation or whether something is called private law, sometimes it's almost a matter of vibes. employment law, competition law, securities law. We all have discussions about whether that's public law, private law, or public law regulation, and some will make the cut on whether the rules restrict activity. Some will make the cut on whether we think the rules focus on cooperation or coordination from a game theory perspective, and some of them will focus on whether the rules are bottom up or top down. But all of these distinctions are gray because they have analytical unity. And these bodies of law have analytical unity in the sense that the externalities that they internalize are not just from an innovator onto others, but they're also the other way around. So we need them to have a functioning market that has innovation. Why does all of this matter? Well, for two reasons I think it matters. The first reason is that it allows us to consider global competitiveness within the argument of this article. So AI innovation, as Professor Barker explains, impacts countries' global competitiveness. So if AI innovation, if AI regulation slows down innovation, then any regulation will put us in a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation, which is often what is portrayed when we talk about the existential risk of AI. Why would we regulate it if other countries won't, and then we all face the same risk anyway? This is particularly bad because global AI markets are a bit of winner takes all because of economics of scale. You need scale to access large databases, and you need scale to access computing capacity. So slowing down AI regulation just a little bit has more than just a little bit of consequences. And so restrictive regulations, such as the ones that some people argue we had for data protection, that reduce the impact of EU firms, could have a significant impact when we compare it with US and Chinese firms. Plus, the innovation offsets that we could have for their regulation could be for foreign companies. It could be that all of the secondary market for compliance, for example, comes from other countries with lighter regulation. So what do we do about this? Well, the second point of why I think this is important is because it helps us imbue regulation with private law and public law principles. So it helps us think better about what type of AI regulation we should have, and not only about whether we should have AI regulation. So saying that regulatory environments like the EU not only have external social benefits, but also they don't inherently impede innovation, implies both a theory of many other things that are stopping AI regulation and a theory of regulation itself that the article has. And broadening this to include all these types of rules, I think will strengthen the argument by telling us about what kind of AI regulation we should have. Mostly, most of data protection's alleged costs that we want to avoid for AI are not so much costs of sanctions, because sanctions haven't been comparatively that high compared to the profit, but rather costs of compliance, and particularly costs of compliance that are fixed. They are the same for very large players and for very small players. So if we try to imbue regulation with private law and public law rules that focus on what is it that we're trying to protect and what is it that we're trying to do, maybe we want to benefit accountability mechanisms over these ex-ante rules that have high compliance costs that are the same for large players and for small players. Maybe you want to favor standards over rules. Maybe you want to address this critique that legislators and regulators don't understand the technology by keeping some flexibility for enforcement mechanisms that could understand it, and avoid the criticism that the technology moves very fast and regulation doesn't, by having regulatory mechanisms that have this flexibility baked in. So that's the main point. I really enjoyed the article, and thank you for coming to speak with us.
Thanks, Ignacio. Carl.
Thanks very much also for the excellent article, and it's a really timely contribution. I think the paper shows very nicely that the European innovation deficit is more long-standing than recent tech regulation would suggest. And I think that has institutional roots. So if you go back to the 18th century, the first industrial revolution happened in Britain. Europe spends most of the 19th century trying to catch up, building institutions effectively targeted to absorb, improve, and scale technologies invented in Britain, such as steam, railroads, and telegraphy. Similarly, during the post-war era, Europe is again in a position where growth is primarily driven by catch-up, this time to the United States. And Marshall aid, in particular, is one of the key mechanisms through which the system of mass production is effectively important to Europe. And that really drives growth in Europe up until the 1970s, when America also slows down and essentially global growth collapses. America then has a brief productivity revival in the 1990s and early 2000s, which Europe does not quite share. The United Kingdom is actually a positive exception to that story, and something that, a little bit of good news. We need all the good news we can get in the UK these days. Unfortunately, that petered out. And so I think a question is, A, why has productivity declined, not just in Europe, but frankly also in the United States and China? And another question is, why hasn't Europe really managed to absorb American technology this time around? And I think digital regulation is not the key driver here. And I think the article nicely illustrates, and we heard today that there are many more important reasons, and I would emphasize labor laws as well, which are important, particularly for smaller firms. When you have new technology, you need to adjust quickly, and you need to be able to hire and fire. That is a fundamental issue as well. But at the same time, I don't think we should pretend that digital regulation is costless, right? So, mentioned the GDPR. There's a huge amount of evidence that it's increased barriers to entry, particularly hurt smaller companies, that it's had negative impacts on innovation, particularly in AI, that it has led to greater market concentration, because the only companies that have actually more or less benefited from this is larger technology companies, which find it easier to comply and have essentially offset compliance costs by capturing a larger share of the market. Now, that is very different from, let's say, antitrust or competition policy, which is also sometimes blamed for Europeans' innovation deficit. And I would ask you, if you ever heard somebody making that point, ask them which merger the Competition Commission blocked, which would have created the European Google. I can assure you that long and uncomfortable silence will follow. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that shows that competition policy, for the most part, is good for innovation. And in fact, part of the explanation, I would suspect, for America's own productivity slowdown is that the rules in the books haven't really been enforced very rigorously for the past 20 years or so. And we see that barriers to entry today are very significant, right? It used to be the case in the 1970s that excess profits in the industry predicted entry. That correlation have essentially broken down, and that very much suggests that smaller firms in the United States as well are facing very significant barriers to entry. It's not a free market, as Milton Friedman would have hoped that it had evolved. And so I think it's important, when we talk about the relationship between regulation and innovation, to think about two different types of regulation. One is anti-competitive and creates barriers to entry. One is pro-competitive and aids entry and competition. And so I think when we look at, for example, companies like Google, Meta, Tesla, Amazon, one thing all of these companies have in common is that they all went public and they become companies in its own right. If we look at WhatsApp, Instagram, YouTube, all of these companies were acquired. And there's something which has sort of tilted the balance in favor of acquisition rather than IPO and competition. And I don't know exactly what has tilted that balance, but I suspect it's a combination of more lax competition law in combination with the more stringent rules and regulations associated with being a public company. And I think if we can manage to tilt that balance, a lot is actually gained from that. with regard to the AI Act and with regard to the GDPR as well, let me say, right, innovation is not the only goal. And I totally agree that, regulation can also be important to steer the direction of technological change. Environmental standards, for example, has driven innovation towards more greener type of technologies. And one might argue, and I think there's some evidence for it, that the GDPR has steered the direction of innovation towards more data sparse, data saving AI technologies that are potentially less privacy intrusive. The benefits of that down the line, I think, is sort of fairly speculative at this stage. But I do think, rules and regulations do not just have an impact on the quantity of innovation, but also the quality and the direction of innovation. And so I think that's a really important point to bear in mind as well. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to read the article. I think it's a really important contribution in terms of showing that Europe's innovation deficit is long-standing. I think thinking about this relationship in terms of anti-competitive and pro-competitive regulation is a footnote I would add to the excellent presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Can we thank the three commentators? You have the chance now to respond.
I can respond quickly or go to the questions, whatever you
I
think.
think you should respond, to whatever you think. You can prioritize some of the points. Don't try to respond to everything.
I mean, this was such a rich set of comments, and I wholeheartedly agree. So I just want to be very brief. First of all, to thank for the deep and thoughtful engagement with the article. And I think there were some issues that I failed to mention in the presentation that were extremely, extremely important to point out. Like, Caroline, when you talk about this whole ecosystem of where we think about states' role is, but also the companies' role themselves. And there, I think the hard question is that companies often try to preempt the government regulations, say we have AI ethics codes and we do this internally, we have the code of conduct. And ultimately, that is the self-regulation, the American market-driven model. But at the same time, we need to recognize that if it comes to any types of digital regulation, we cannot just do it sort of from top down. You need to ultimately, you can't even enforce and implement and monitor all of it. So you need to co-opt the companies and change their incentives so that they also do self-regulate. And you don't need to spend all the time in trying to force them towards compliance. And I think particularly interesting industries like you talk about the care sector, where I think we still have very thin regulatory frameworks. So we also need to think sort of sequentially, like do we first try to get something going at the level of the actual players in the industry, and then we try to institutionalize those by the governments. Also, I wanted to maybe you ask at least indirectly what will happen in the US and whether the US is now all the more committed to the market-driven model. And I think that is probably the likely outcome. It is a very deregulatory agenda that the US is pursuing, but there are many question marks just because President Trump is so unpredictable. And it was under him when we started these antitrust cases against Google, for instance. So he's not a big fan of these tech companies. He's now changed his mind about TikTok ban, which he first insisted, but then he met with one of his billionaire donors who is a big shareholder in Baidu that owns TikTok, and he now changed his mind and say that actually if we ban TikTok, Facebook will gain, and Facebook is the enemy of the people. So he's also not a fan of big tech. Then comes the question that Elon Musk, how much Elon is actually running the show. Elon is also an interesting character in many ways, but also when it comes to his approach to regulation. He is an absolute fanatic free speech proponent. He's a maximalist there. But then he's, for instance, very worried about catastrophic risks around AI. He supported the California bill on existential risk. He signed the moratorium because he's very worried about existential risk. If you look at why he started Tesla, he said he's worried about climate change on the existential level. SpaceX, because he wants to colonize Mars when the planet becomes inhabitable. He has this idea about, for instance, existential risk. So he's not totally 100% opposed to AI regulation, but he also has his way of saying, if you let me develop my AI, it's in the hands of somebody who cares about existential risk and who keeps us safe. So I wouldn't really trust that path either there. Ignacio, one thing that so many issues that you mentioned, but one thing that I failed to mention, and I think it ties to what you also said, Carl, that we need to think about pro-competitive and anti-competitive regulation. This asymmetrical approach to regulation, as opposed to let's regulate everybody equally, I think is the key. That's why I'm very sympathetic to the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act in the sort of fundamental regulatory design on imposing greater obligations to the parties that can cause the greatest harms and that have the opportunity to comply. But at the same time, it's also sometimes a little bit tricky. I read there was a really good investigative journalism in New York Times about Telegram around the time that Durov was taken by the French authorities for the harms that the Telegram has caused by failing to moderate speech. Telegram just falls underneath the obligations of the threshold for the extensive obligations under Digital Services Act. And actually, even though I really am not a fan of Facebook's content moderation policies, there's much worse content on some of these smaller platforms, including the Telegram. So sometimes you think about whether it's just the focus on the big tech. We also need to make sure that we focus on the niche platforms, which become sort of havens for disinformation and hate speech that basically have no policies. And the same thing with AI, that it's not only the kind of the big companies and the AI development that we need to worry about, but I subscribe to the philosophy being mindful of regulation being particularly costly for small and medium-sized companies, but then thinking about also that we cannot just leave that sort of let the small companies off the hook. That's why we have the sandboxes and ways how we can help them with compliance and so forth. So maybe that is also something to think about. Also then this question, and I think you were more nuanced than I was in my remarks in thinking about how the regulations like AI Act and the GDPR can enhance compliance. It's very tricky when you read the economists doing some excellent, very important work of actually trying to examine the influence that the effect that these regulations are having on the ground. We now start having already analysis of the GDPR because that has been in force for some time. The analysis of the DMA and AI Act is more prospective and still speculative. But then when you look at, there was a pretty widely cited research showing that with the GDPR entering into force, tons of apps disappeared from Google Play Store. And that seemed to be, okay, we see reduction in innovation. But then when you actually go deeper and start looking at the kinds of apps that disappeared, many of them were copycat innovations, but not the kinds of innovations that are really worth protecting. So for us to hold back our rights-driven regulation to protect the kinds of innovations that are either, just insufficiently innovated to deserve protection or outright harmful. So I think we also need to be mindful of that. So as much as I'm trying to and sort of embrace your comments about that we need to be nuanced about what kind of innovation is what kind of regulation is beneficial, we really need to take a hard look at what is the kind of innovation that is truly worth protecting.
Fantastic. So we will have Q&A, but I'm just going to abuse my position and ask you something because it's directly related to this. Actually, two things. So one thing, more general, is the distinction between the motivations that are actually driving people and their ideological self-presentation. So the ideological self-presentation of the Americans is, as you say, an obsession with the free market. Is that the reality? Or is it really about protecting a certain form of capitalistic monopoly? That there are these small number of corporations that are huge and they want to protect their position. And what part of protecting it is creating barriers to others competing with them. So I think it's really important not to buy into their rhetoric. Okay. The second thing I would say is, I think your paper is amazing in breaking down this significance of some sort of zero-sum competition between regulation and innovation. And I think the commentators have been excellent in emphasizing that it's not regulation per se that's the issue, it's the type of regulation, whether it's competitive or pro-competitive, anti-competitive, whether it protects rights or it doesn't. But I think we should also disaggregate, and this is the point you just finished on, the notion of innovation. I think this is one of the most important things. Now, the first thing is I don't think regulation and innovation are on a par, because regulation per se is neither good nor bad. Whereas I take, contrary to what you said, innovation is a good thing. You don't normally say, this is a terrible innovation. You know what I'm saying? It's usually a sort of a positive description of something. Why? Because at least we now have new knowledge or new capabilities we didn't have before. And what I thought was really interesting in your paper is you identified a number of reasons why innovation might be valuable. So one was it simply spurs economic growth, so we're wealthier. Another is in the context of geopolitical competition. We can't risk falling behind China. A third one is innovation might itself give expression to rights, like my right to engage in economic activity, or my right to speak freely, which regulations might threaten. And then the fourth point, which is there are really beneficial innovations and others that are not so beneficial. They simply cater to some consumer interest, which might be trivial, but others that actually help address the issue of social care are really important. And I kind of think that what really needs to happen is to get behind the labels, regulation, innovation, to the values underlying the situation. And so, is it simply that we're talking about economic growth, which may not be distributed all that fairly, or are we talking about innovation that promotes genuine common goods or genuine rights?
Yeah. Absolutely. If I may quickly comment on that too, I think you are absolutely spot on with this idea that this rhetoric of America's commitment to free market, the market is not free. It is so concentrated. It is very hard to unlock competition there. And I recommend a book by Thomas Philippon, a French economist who teaches at NYU. And who's written this book, Great Reversal, that talks about why the American market is actually less competitive than Europe. It cost me much more to fly from New York to Chicago than it cost me to fly from Brussels to Madrid. So because there hasn't been antitrust enforcement in the US, so the airline prices are much, much higher because the market is very concentrated. My phone calls are much cheaper in Europe because of the competition enforcement that has actually lowered the prices for consumers. And we need to understand those are direct benefits to consumer welfare that stem from regulation, for more stringent competition regulation. That has been absent, that was pretty much dormant in the US for about 20 years, even though there was this ideological belief that we are really keeping the market free, but it is no longer free. And that's why we saw this reversal, and especially under Biden. We have had, if you just read about what kind of remedies the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is seeking in the Google antitrust case, it's seeking to break up the company. I don't think that is going to happen. And the US courts have not quite possibly sort of bought into the antitrust revolution to the same extent that some of these agencies are. And I think Trump is going to change who is running these agencies. So it might be short-lived, this attempt to push the enforcement agenda. But that's not good for the free market in the US. You actually need to enforce some of these regulations. And the second, I really welcome you in a nuanced way laying out this invitation how we need to disaggregate both the concept of regulation and innovation. And I think one question for all of us, and what I try to always push when I'm in Europe, is that what is the kind of innovation that the Europeans ought to be pursuing? I mentioned in my talk, we don't necessarily want to have a European Google. We don't like the surveillance capitalist model. So I don't think we necessarily could achieve another Google, but not should we necessarily try to aim for that. So should we rather in the AI space think about the robots that can help with medical care, or then think about the ways that we can kind of further the innovations that would be consistent with the social welfare commitments of the European, with some of the values and the deep commitment to the ethics and equality, and how AI can be harnessed to help us mitigate climate change, the kind of issues that I think are genuine innovations with tremendous economic potential, but also the kind of societal spillovers that are consistent with the European values. And I think that's the right conversation to be had. And right now, the Europeans, when we are trying to revive our economies and our technological competitiveness, we are not able to sort of forge a multi-front battle necessarily and try to conquer all the different industries where innovation is possible. So I think we would need to prioritize in terms of where we allocate our resources, what kind of research we are trying to pursue, and what kind of research can be commercialized in the way that also has greater societal value.
That's really great comment. And this also applies to the UK. The white paper that the UK produced on AI talked about innovation exclusively in terms of promoting economic growth. And then rights come in as a kind of constraint on this innovation. Whereas in fact, you could have pro-rights-based innovation, couldn't you? So there's a kind of reductive interpretation innovation that's purely economistic. And in case anyone thinks this is just an anti-American point, I also think that the European self-presentation as rights protecting also needs to be put under the microscope. And your point about Europe needing to have an acceptance of sort of well-intentioned criticism is very important. Caroline and I have written, Jeremiah Adams-Prassel has written about the ways in which potentially the AI Act undermines rights protection rather than protecting it. Okay, so again, self-presentation is one thing, the reality is another. Let's have questions. Kyle.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I was really interested in the one of the explanations you gave about cultural attitudes towards risk taking. And as a fellow Northern European, I'd prefer not saying that we're afraid of failure, but that we're very prudent, and that's a virtue. But part of that, let's say, slightly jokey question is that because it's thought of as a good thing to be prudent, what that could be one of the things that's holding back. Let's say maybe some forms of European innovation or like these kinds of like good forms of risk taking. I'm just curious as to like what you think we should do to shift these attitudes. I know you mentioned some of these bankruptcy laws being more lenient in the United States versus Europe, but I'm wondering just like generally, I guess, because I think it's really important to focus not on these attitudes and these norms that I think are just often neglected in these discussions as driving a lot of these changes. So yeah, that's my question.
So I really appreciate the question because culture in many ways is harder to change. And the laws can be rewritten, but if you are either wired to take risks and put yourself out there or not, how do you change that? And I must say, I witness that every day in the classroom, teaching in the United States. There's much more intellectual risk-taking. There's some crazy, crazy comments that the students are willing to put forward, and I love it. And then they push back. And I think there's not always that prudence. And sometimes, yes, they go off the rails. But the same thing is that I do think there is a kind of risk-taking, even in articles, sometimes in sort of scholarly world, that sometimes goes wrong, the same way some of the American companies go horribly wrong. So there's FTX, crypto space, all those things where you see the kind of the risk-taking that goes too far and where more prudence would have been needed. But ultimately, some of those succeed. So you need to have the kind of risk-taking. And I think partially it's just I noticed that I grew up in Finland, so I didn't grow up with risk-taking. I'm raising Finnish-American kids in New York City. And I notice how they put themselves from lower school, they present in front of the class. It's show and tell. You bring your toy and you tell the whole class why the toy is important for you. And you are 5 and you take the stage and you are not embarrassed. Then there's music performances. You've learned to make one sound of your trumpet. So you go in front of the whole school and you make that one sound and they clap. And the idea is that there's something about you can do it, that the positive mentality. And I just think one way you can probably nurture that is that you start celebrating failures, that people who are associated, seen as being extremely successful, tell why they fail and tell about how it hasn't been a smooth path. The press would publish the stories. I think if you look at some people like I mentioned Steve Jobs, he was fired from Apple. And he said how that really sort of set him free and he entered one of the most creative periods of his life. Americans love the stories when somebody goes through a rough patch and then they re-emerge. And I think in many ways for us to kind of really publicly tell how we don't always succeed, it becomes more acceptable. So maybe that's one way to do it.
But this is a very deep issue here. America is a culture of immigrants. Yeah. So it's basically a people who have taken the risk of moving to another continent, who believe in being born again, that whatever misfortunes they've suffered wherever they came from, that's not the end of them, that doesn't define them. They can make something new of themselves. And the other thing is, it is a culture that is very receptive to the immigrant, that you overnight can become an American and be accepted in America. Is Europe going to be able to replicate this?
Yeah, I think that ties well both kind of the risk-taking frontier mentality that comes with the sort of the immigrant culture in the US, but also one point that I mentioned, that this whole attitude towards diversity and embracing immigration. And there's probably a reason it wasn't in the Draghi report. It was a one big missing piece of what the Europeans need to do for competitiveness, because the whole conversation around immigration is so charged in Europe. And that is to a great, great detriment. And at the same time, we also have this balancing act that there's sort of concerns about increasing Chinese espionage. So Americans under Trump had this China initiative where many of the Chinese researchers were basically targeted in leading US universities. But if you look at the statistics of who is innovating in the cutting edge of AI in leading US institutions, and you look at like which companies, there was a wonderful study that I cite in the paper as well, looking at the leading AI conference and where did the best papers came from. So the researchers looked at for this NeurIPS conference where the 20% of the papers that were accepted, and used that as a proxy for top 20% of the global AI research talent. So what were the institutions? I think about 60% came from the US institutions of those researchers, leading institutions being Google and Stanford. But then when you looked at where the undergraduate degree was done by those top researchers, the number one country was China. So if the US is trying to push the Chinese researchers out of the US and back to China, that is exactly the most self-defeating strategy. The Netherlands was working on, at least recently, on a legislation to try to keep the Chinese researchers out of certain fields in the PhD for the fear of espionage. And I am not saying that espionage doesn't happen, because it does, but the kind of blanket sort of xenophobic initiatives that target some of the biggest talent that is making the US great. So the Americans are also struggling now with its commitment to immigration that has been a strength for the country. And I think the Europeans have an even more complex. So that there's not the kind of same way of embracing that everybody is an immigrant and diversity is necessarily a strength of the society. And I think that really needs to be reversed, and there needs to be an easier way to immigrate to Europe, which also requires thinking about how your spouses, family members can immigrate. But I think in this political environment, it has been a very hard conversation to lean on.
Great. So there's a question from Michael.
Terrific discussion. Thank you for all of it. None of you have mentioned the word protectionism. And the potential use of regulation for protectionist purposes to prevent market entry of Americans into Europe or Europeans into the United States. And you just edged into another aspect of protection, which is, keeping Chinese students out. We seem to have a regulatory model in which you have an open international economy in which, Brussels standards spread worldwide, and that's what makes Europe a great regulatory power. But that presumes an international economy. How do things look in an increasingly protectionist, tariff-driven, closed-down international economy in which states are regulating migration so that they don't have domestic competition? They're regulating entry of companies into markets in order to protect their national champions and so on. None of that has been a feature of the discussion, but it does seem to me where we're headed at the moment, and it concerns everybody. I'm just wondering whether you could talk about that issue.
Just a footnote to that. There was this claim that Trump might use the threat of tariffs against Europe to make Europe move towards a more American approach, contrary to what the direction you've been talking about. Can we take you, Val, as well, since you're next door, and then you can answer the questions.
Sure. So thank you very much. This was very, very interesting. So I think you make a compelling case that, the problems of Europe do not start and end with regulation. But given that we have these structural problems that are already, in a way, render it less likely that a new startup would open up shop in Europe as opposed to North America. And given the fact, and you talked about Elon Musk, the idea, I think something that you could add to this list of problems, maybe it's not a problem, it's a good thing, but in terms of making this decision, it could be perceived as a problem, and that is this idea of regulatory capture, which in North America, so the fact that Musk is now will be part of the US government, right? I mean, this is going to be hyper regulatory capture, but this is not just Musk. I mean, even the other companies, they operate in the United States, the large companies, because they know that it's highly unlikely that the regulation that would be extremely detrimental to their interest would pass because of the way the political system is, is structured and funded. So when you have this already deficit in attractiveness, the question is whether even a perception of excessive regulation, even if you could justify each and every regulatory instrument and provision, which it's going to be difficult, but I mean, maybe if you accept that this, on the whole, it's good and it protects the consumers and it does protect rights. But when you just look at the sheer number of regulatory instruments, I saw a table that in the last 2 years, there have been more than 30 regulatory instruments that were put forward, either passed or promoted within the EU institutions, all dealing with digital technology, and they didn't count some other regulatory instruments, such as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So there's a sense that Europe is regulating itself ad nauseum, and this is an environment in which if you're a business and you're making this decision, it's something that you need to consider. So I'm wondering what's your take on this idea of maybe there is some overdose in regulation, regardless of the quality of the regulation that we're speaking of.
So these are terrific questions. Maybe I share a few remarks, but then I would love to hear what my co-panelists think about, because these are very broad questions. So let me take them in reverse. So even though I am sort of pro the kind of regulation that the European and general regulatory philosophy, I completely agree that you need to take a very hard look to, are all these regulations necessary? Is there a way to streamline it? And you're right, there could even be just a perception of over-regulation that is deterring companies and entrepreneurs, and they don't want to set up and incorporate in Europe. But you also need to think about what is the alternative to all those European regulations. It's not that there's no regulation, it's there's 27 different regulations as opposed to the European one. So in many ways, the companies, when I talk to some of the tech companies, including, let's say, Uber, they say just like, give me any regulation, but just give me one. I don't want to negotiate with Barcelona and then city by city and then often country by country. So ultimately, you are integrating the EU through regulation. You are removing the regulatory barriers by having a common harmonized regulatory scheme. So that also, I think we need to distinguish that often the problem is not the kind of the stringency of the regulation, but the complexity if we don't have enough harmonization. But I wholeheartedly agree that we also need to think about how we can reduce red tape. And there are sort of the struggles that do slow companies down, and I think we need to take that seriously. So, Michael, I'm really grateful you raised protectionism, because I think we are seeing just a massive, massive shift where the entire world is moving towards greater techno-nationalism, techno-protectionism, and Trump's love of tariffs are real. So I think they are coming. And in some ways, they are deglobalizing us. But I do not think the kind of full technological decoupling is possible. The Chinese and the US markets are so intertwined that there is no way that even if those trade barriers will be there, that somehow we can totally sort of disassociate and untie those economic links between the two economies. So even though right now, if you think about the trade war that Trump started against China last time around, and Biden largely kept all those tariffs in place. So under Trump, it was America first. Under Biden, it was American workers first. But it hasn't been a free trade regime. So Americans have been doubling down on that. But at the same time, we have all these measures like export licenses. We still keep granting those licenses because American companies, partially for the capture reasons, are lobbying to be able to continue to do business in China because that's where they make so much profit. That is funding their innovative activities. The same way that the Chinese have not managed to pull the plug and actually tell their companies that they cannot list in US stock exchanges. They still need access to that international capital. So I don't think we're going to see full decoupling of the stock market either. We are going to see costs on trade. And I think the cost for Europeans too, because Trump doesn't really distinguish between adversaries and allies. Europeans are going to face tariffs as well. But I think the US needs to also realize that you cannot, even last time when there was the trade war against China, because Trump was really obsessed with trade deficit, the deficit didn't go down. Because the US cannot manufacture everything within the US. Then you need to trade with other trading partners. And there are lots of Chinese goods coming to the US through other ways, through other countries. So I think ultimately it's really hard to very effectively wage the kind of trade and technology war, even if you're committed to protectionism as an ideology, that it would be complete. So I think we are entering in the kind of very uneasy place between globalization and decoupling, where we have these periods of escalation alternate with periods of de-escalation because of the lobbying to some extent, because the businesses still need access to global markets. And the whole idea that the Europeans have been able to regulate the global marketplace, it relies on some notion of globalization, that the idea that the companies are doing business in multiple markets. I don't think that's going to be sort of fundamentally ending. But I think the challenges are real and the costs are real, and they are felt by everybody.
Does anyone else want to come in on any of those questions?
No, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think if you look at Britain in the post-war era, right, it was a combination of excessive market concentration and being outside Europe that led to corporations with very low levels of productivity and poor corporate governance, etc., right? So if we start to impose more protectionist measures at the time, we're also having very high levels of market concentration domestically. It's a recipe for very slow productivity growth indeed.
Anyone else? We have like 9 minutes left, and there are 2 questions I've got already. So Linda, and then there's a question there. So if we can keep the questions short, then we can get more out of the speakers.
Thank you very much for the talk and the comments, all super engaging. I was hoping to invite you to say a little bit more about the global geopolitical aspect of the relationship between regulation and innovation, which is the aspect where some people worry that they can't call for regulation in some places because of largely unregulated innovation in other places. So that seems to be a worry that often comes up in response to military applications of very harmful AI, where the worry is, given that countries like China and Russia seem to be focused solely on innovation, it's pretty useless to call for regulation in not just Europe but also the US. So what do you think is the best response to that kind of worry?
Thank you. I'm very encouraged that there's discussion about investors, because I think we have to accept the fact that it's only by getting the global investors on side in terms of encouraging responsible behaviour that we can hope to really improve the situation. I think gone are the days when any jurisdiction, including the EU, can on its own expect to have a decisive influence in what goes on in the world. But these global investors, obviously, they own these companies wherever they move to. And I have to say, the good news is that under the Lord Mayor's Ethical AI Initiative, we got over $30 trillion of investors, assets under management for investors, supporting a consensus on responsible AI. And we're working on that to develop an investor council on responsible AI. Because if you're a very big investor, then you don't want externalities imposed, because one, your company makes an extra 100 billion and all the rest of your portfolio loses 200 billion in value, you're worse off. So I think we do need to work with and engage with the investors, because they're the only natural allies we've got.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So one on the sort of military AI and the difficulties of global cooperation and regulation. The US is really sort of rethinking whether it should also be starting to regulate the tech companies. But that kind of what I call a vertical battle between government and tech companies takes place in the shadow of that horizontal battle, the China-US tech war. And it's very hard for the US to justify regulating the actions of the very asset that it needs to prevail in the contest for technological supremacy against China. So we are always going to see, and the tech companies are really latching on to this argument, you need us. This is a geopolitical contest. We are your champions, and if we don't do it, the Chinese will do it. It's a very effective message. And so I would sort of distinguish that we sometimes, understanding this reality, we need to try to think if there are still some domains where we can sort of surpass the kind of geopolitical context and think that we even need to, the United States and China need to regulate together. And I think military is one thing, that even at the height of the Cold War, there were arms control treaties between the US and the Soviets. And there would need to be, it's not in the interest of China nor the United States that non-state actors and sort of ill-motivated actors get a hold of dangerous AI and use it against humanity. When we talk about threats that are common to humanity, that's not an ideological question between democracy and autocracy. The Chinese should also get behind that, and Americans should be able to sit down with the Chinese on that. So including issues, I think, when it comes to regulating rights versus risks, I'm less optimistic that there's any space to think about the rights where the Chinese and Americans agree. But with risks, including existential risk, I think there is a potentially an opportunity to cooperate. Investors, I absolutely agree that ultimately the money will be, the flows of that money will determine what kind of innovations will be supported, funded, and will emerge, and which not. But I go back and forth in how much faith I have in our investors being committed to supporting, for instance, ethical innovations. So even if some of these American tech giants haven't been particularly ethical, you don't necessarily like Facebook's business model, but look at the gains in the stock market. You continue to pour money still in these tech companies because they are really doing tremendously well, and they generate the wealth to the investors. So I think in many ways we need to think about how much we can count on the investors being kind of making the investment allocations based on their values versus then based on where the rewards are, the same way that I've been calling for advertisers, for instance, not to advertise in the kinds of platforms where the advertising is next to disinformation and hate speech. And they were boycotting X for a while, but they often keep coming back. If that's where the money is, that's where the eyeballs are, that's where the market is. But I think you are absolutely right that the real players, sometimes we as users of digital technologies, we are too, I think, sort of addicted to convenience, that we continue to use the platforms where the defaults are such that we keep being engaged, as opposed to then taking more costly, time-consuming decisions to be more informed users. Investors should have the bandwidth and the kind of analytical capacity to make those decisions. But ultimately, I think sometimes it works in favor of more beneficial sort of innovations that they are proud to invest in and where the reputational gains are too. But I am not fully betting on them sort of decoupling from the kind of just purely thinking about where the money is.
You're putting a bigger bet, it seems to me, on consumers in your article, and about the potential that they will have a kind of demand for more ethical products.
Yes, I think that's where I'm hoping, but I think we also look at the studies about the consumers all saying they want more privacy. But then when you approach them with the question, what about if, you lose free shipping? Oh, then no, I need my Amazon free shipping more than I actually need my privacy. So I put some faith in the employees in these tech companies.
Yes.
That the generation of lawyers that I am training at Columbia, who used to, when I brought a tech executive there was a beeline. They all wanted to have a job at Google or Meta. Now they don't really tell their classmates if they're going to work for Meta. They don't want to tell their parents that they are working for the company that is behind all this disinformation around elections and all that. So there needs to be, I think, some pushback that comes from within the companies. And it did come with things like when Google was trying to go to the Chinese the market with the Project Dragonfly and develop a censored search engine. It was the employees who said, I am not doing this. I am not facilitating the Chinese censorship. And Google needed to push back. Investors were key there too, by the way. Investors said too that we are not willing to have Google go into the Chinese market and basically capitulate to the authoritarian rulers. So there is a combination. I think we need everybody. We need the investors, we need the employees, we need the sort of informed consumers who are pushing back on these companies. And I think the reputational deficit is real. These companies no longer are just we still like their products. We need their products. But I think they don't have anymore the upper hand in the conversation where the society wouldn't be conscious also of the downsides of the products and services that they are producing.
Thank you. And is there anyone who wants to add anything to this?
I mean, I think that's a great answer. And the fact that we need many people involved is important. I think one of the problems that we have with digital markets is that in normal markets, money is to a greater or lesser extent a manifestation of preferences. And we could trust or not trust consumers to buy clothes that are made ethically, for example. But at least we know that consumers, if we tell them, can make that choice. But in data context, you don't have that choice, because not only we don't read privacy policies, and we did read them, we wouldn't understand them, but also inference are made on the back end besides the information that we disclose. So data doesn't work as an expression of preferences in the way that money does. So the consumers cannot constrain producers of data products in the way that they can constrain producers of other products. In that context, we need to rely on people like investors and on people like employees. And we need to try to govern the agency problems that investors could have, where maybe they have incentives to fund lots of companies regardless of the ethics that they may have, and then hope that one of them becomes Facebook.
Just one brief point on national security. So when AT&T was broken up in 1987, the company argued that that would essentially jeopardize the lines of communication and would be a breach to national security, right? And had that not happened, when the NSF handed over essentially the foundational technologies of what would become the internet, it would probably have handed over them to AT&T, which would probably at the time not have seen any direct commercial benefit of them and probably killed the project. And so, when it comes to national security, I think you should be more concerned about the lack of innovation. And I think American national security is better off by having competition and innovation than this is trying to minimize, certain aspects like, the communication lines of AT&T, for example.
Caroline?
I would just say that even though that is the truth, what you just said, the investors are chasing the money, I don't think it's mutually exclusive to have ethical innovation that is also, strong in terms of the economic potential. So, and I truly believe that just because we are at that stage at the moment, doesn't mean that it should be like that. And we do need investors who are very much in that direction and talking about ethical and responsible AI. So.
Can I say one thing just in closing about national security and sort of comparing internet revolution to AI revolution? The militaries are dependent on private sector innovations in AI. So the modern military technologies, they're not Pentagons that are funding them. But the US, it was the Defense Department that really gave the funding for what then became the internet and everything. Then it came from the government, and then there were commercial applications. Now it's dual-use technologies where the innovators all happen in the private sector. And if you look at AI, they are the only ones that have the money to really innovate at the cutting edge of these technologies. So the universities, even great universities like the Oxford and Columbia's, have minuscule budgets for pursuing sort of the frontier technologies that then could become also important for public innovation. So we're very dependent on the private sector. And that, I think, makes also the kind of the national security question where we're so intertwined.
Okay, on that nuanced note, I think we have to end. Can we thank our speakers for a really excellent colloquium?